fourth of our continuing video series that takes a look at Dawn of Man by Madruga Works and a functioning prehistoric village. As we get closer to actual history, this era basically takes a look at the Copper Age, which basically focuses on the era from about 5000 BCE to about 3200 BCE. So in previous lectures, we took a look at how the community had expanded from a small series of hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic era to now kind of this burgeoning settlement here in the Copper Age. And obviously what we'll take a look in this era is, oh, there's a dead lady over there, so let's go pick her up. But ultimately, we're going to be taking a look at the Copper Age and how it's different than previous eras. So during this era, of course, a lot of similarities to the Neolithic era, which we talked about before. Buildings largely are going to be similar. Obviously, people still are doing a lot of the same things, but I would say some big differences. The biggest one, of course, being that of the creation of different kinds of tools. So during previous eras, including the Neolithic, most people would essentially craft tools that were made out of bone and stone. Right? Those were the two go-tos. As we get into the Copper Age, people obviously develop the ability to actually work with metals. And the metal that's going to ultimately be really important during this era is essentially that of copper. Let me see if I can find an actual copper deposit. Here you go. Right. So a copper ore tends to be important in the respect that copper is a metal that is easy to work with. It is malleable. It tends to be easy to work with. As mentioned before, it can be made into a variety of different substances, and it tends to be something that is going to be a little bit more durable than using stone. And so I think people started using copper for a variety of different tools. Typically, they would be forged at a workshop of sorts, and they could make spears. They could make primitive kinds of weapons. They could make axes. They could make all kinds of things with it. And so copper tended to be one of those really important tools that could be used in a variety of ways. The downside of using copper, as we'll talk about in the next series, is that copper simply was too flimsy. Typically making a sword out of it or a weapon out of it, if you whacked it against something else, copper would take the shape of whatever it hit. And so ultimately you don't want a sword that starts off straight and then magically becomes curved, because it literally, like Looney Tunes style, curves over the person that you're attacking. Right? You don't want weapons that are flimsy. You want something that's got a little more substance. And so this was a problem with using copper, is that it wasn't the strongest of metals. Its malleability was good, but it was also a downside. So humans started looking to other substances later, which we'll take a look at in the next series, which looks at bronze. But the way in which they would do it is they would obviously mine the copper, and then once the copper was brought in, they would have a charcoal pit, as you can see here, where they would take wood and they would cover it, and then they would let it smolder. And then eventually the smoldering would lead to charcoal, right? And that charcoal could then be used to heat the copper, right, in a furnace, a pit furnace, and then that would basically turn it into, from copper ore into the copper that could be used as a weapon or a spear or things that they were going to use it for. And so those are some of the ways in which copper was created. Another aspect that's different during this era, obviously we hate to see people die, but instead of carrying people with sledges, now you basically had a cart, right? And so you have really two things here. Obviously you've got carts that have been created through the creation of the wheel, which has come into its own. With the creation of the wheel, this now allows for carts, it allows for chariots, it allows for any kind of wheeled vehicles. And the other thing that's significant about this is Mr. Donkey here. Donkeys become domesticated during this period. Donkeys obviously could pull very heavy loads. Obviously for carts, they could be used to basically pull plows. They were basically a really important pack animal that's going to play a major role in human society. And so the donkey gets introduced at some time during this period, or is known as the onager, right, the wild donkey in parts of Persia and Sumer. Right. Another animal, of course, that makes its appearance during this period, of course, is the cow. Cattle, of course, get domesticated during this period. Obviously, cattle perform a variety of roles in human settlements, from providing milk, which is important, obviously their meat, which is significant, and because of their size, right, they can also be important, right? Lazy cow's gonna take a nap. But basically, they can perform other duties as well as beasts of burden. So cattle could be used to pull plows as well. They could be used to do those kinds of tasks because of their size and their strength. So all of these are ways in which the animals of this period enriched human life and certainly made it significantly better. As mentioning on our, you know, tirade here about cows, another aspect that is important to obviously cattle is cheese. So one of the things that they could do is take milk, which tends to spoil very, very quickly. Any of you who've had sour milk can obviously testify to this. And instead, right, they could make cheese. By letting the milk curdle and then adding various things to it, right, they could make cheese. And cheese certainly is a staple of our diets today. And certainly for those of you who live in the Midwest and those places, I know, especially where I grew up, almost everything had cheese in it. And so it's going to play a role in helping populations survive as well. So all of these, I think, are advances of the Copper Age. One final one that we'll look at here, which is important, is, of course, wells. So typically, what most prehistoric societies did before the Copper Age, and even the Neolithic era when it's invented, pottery, right? Well, there's even pottery even before the Neolithic age, honestly. But ultimately, the invention of pottery is important because basically what you can do, right, is now, right, you can basically build, wells inside communities. Pottery was important because especially in the Mesolithic era, right, people could now go to the water, right, and they could basically put, all of the water inside of a jar, right, these big jars which were made out of pottery, and then you could basically take those clay jars in and store them, right, to be used. And so that was obviously significant. Paleolithic people certainly didn't have this advantage because most of them ultimately just had to drink straight out of the water. So anytime you were thirsty, you had to go to the lake or the river source, and it was extraordinarily inefficient. But now, right, you can build wells, right? People could dig deep enough to find groundwater, and so for the most part, the water comes to you instead of you having to go to it. And I think that plays a role in human societies as well, because although humans can go a while without eating, drinking obviously is going to be extraordinarily important. And of course, we talked about the importance of domestication, right? You can see, of course, milk coming from a goat, right? Obviously, this is going to be significant in that you can produce cheese, you can produce a variety of byproducts that are going to keep humans alive. So I think it pretty much hits most of the major aspects of the Copper Age. What we're basically going to take a look at in the next series is how the weaknesses of copper could be supplemented with other metals, right, to make something even better, bronze. And that's what we'll take a look at next, is the Bronze Age.